Joining us is Denis Campbell. He is editor-in-chief of UK Progressive Magazine, also host of Worldview with Denis Campbell, youtube.com/worldview show. Denis, we've been reading a lot about the recent violence and casualties in Egypt. There are conflicting numbers, there is a lot of conflicting information, and in many cases just lack of information. For people who may not have been following, let's just kind of first start with this recent bubbling of violence that's taking place.
Well, as your viewers are probably well aware, the government Egyptian President Morsi was eliminated essentially 6 weeks ago. The military reached a point where they looked at the situation. They were never happy with the fact that a radical Islamist such as Morsi had been duly elected in a democratic process. And they were really looking for an opportunity to sort of ramp up against him. And it was a year, and I think it was 3 or 4 days from when he was sworn in, that public sentiment had finally reached a point where 15 million people marched in the streets, even more than marched against Mubarak 2.5 years earlier. And the army moved very quickly this time and basically said, "You're done." They tried to install a sort of a caretaker government until a new parliament could be formed and a new president elected. Included in that group was Mohammed al-Baradei, who was one of the opposition leaders, but he wasn't selected by the opposition. And you have a situation where it quickly devolved into chaos. The supporters of Morsi were quick to call this a military coup. Of course, the US government could not call it a coup because that would immediately shut off all aid, military and otherwise, to Egypt. Today, just a few minutes ago, President Obama came out and announced that there would be no joint military exercises between US and Egyptian forces. So that's off the table. And basically, we've got ourselves a complete mess at this point.
So I think that given the lack of completely up-to-date and factual information, we kind of understand that there is this chaotic situation. I think an interesting thing to talk about, which you and I were talking about before we went on air today, is that every time that any level of violence bubbles up in Egypt, you see a lot of criticism from people around the world saying, why hasn't this worked yet? Why aren't things all resolved and everything is all set so far? Do you think that the timeline that is implicit in those questions is even a reasonable one, historically speaking?
The only thing I can do, David, is to say, look at your own country as an example there in the United States. I mean, if you go all the way back to the start of I believe they call it the difficulties with the colonies here on this side of the pond, that all started back well before the Declaration of Independence. You had all sorts of problems with taxation without representation, all sorts of demands by the crown on the colonists in terms of giving up income and things of that sort. And the real Boston Tea Party, not what we see going on right now in the recess period, was something that happened well before the start of the actual formal war in 1775. When the British came over with troops, and you have Lexington and Concord and all the battles that occurred around that, that then took another year on top of that to get to the point where we finally declared victory and independence from the crown. Well, that's 1776. It then took the United States through Federalist Papers and lots of other tax issues and lots of internal fights. Indeed, there were a couple of more invasions by the crown at that point in time to try and get back what they'd lost. It took 11 years until 1787 when the actual U.S. Constitution was formed. Now, we're talking about a period where basically we condensed all of Lexington, Concord, and every single one of the battles of the American Revolutionary War into 18 days in Egypt. And I think the simple fact that they were able to get rid of Hosni Mubarak so quickly has also worked very much against them. When I look at the situation today, my heart goes out most to I call them students, but they were really much older than that, the ones that actually did the heavy lifting that started this revolution, because they started it for all the right reasons. Then the opportunists came to the table, And by opportunist, I'm talking the Muslim Brotherhood and the political parties that had an agenda, because they'd been pretty much banished for about 80 years, but they'd been functioning underground. And I often compare the revolutionaries that actually caused Mubarak to resign to the US Occupy movement, to what we're seeing right now with the fracking thing going on down in Balcombe in southeast England. The seeds and the tools to foment revolution are dramatically different from the tools needed to then move forward. So one of the issues I've always been very, very concerned about is the lack of involvement in the political process to try and advance the cause of the revolutionaries, the Occupy movement, those that are against fracking. It's all well and good to be out there and protesting. Indeed, people are dying out there protesting. I've lost several friends over the course of the last day. And you sit there and you say, okay, but what are you going to do to actually now go from being a protester to actually being part of the group that brings about the real fundamental systemic change that needs to happen?
I think that's excellent, excellent context for people who may not understand that maybe because the success came so quickly at the beginning of the revolution, the expectations may now be completely off in a historical context, more broadly speaking, and about the Constitution. So I think that's really, really good, good stuff for our audience. And Dennis, what's coming up on Worldview Show?
Well, coming up on Worldview Show, depending on whether or not I'm able to get some interviews out of Egypt, because I've got a couple of friends there that I'm trying to get some stuff on. We may preempt the existing show that we've got for tonight, but we've got tonight a very interesting guy by the name of Earl Wilson Jr. Now, some people may recognize the name of his father, Earl Wilson Sr. He was the original gossip columnist for the New York Post. Now, his son has written a couple of very interesting musicals. One of them is entitled Yes, which is his idea of what would happen if Barack Obama and Martin Luther King actually met face to face. And we're very excited to have this conversation, because this is a man who wrote a very, very big off-Broadway hit back in the 1980s called Let My People Come. And that's has nothing to do with race relations. It was a sex romp, and it was an incredible musical that did enormous numbers and allowed him to do these things. But the Yes musical is going to be coming out in Kansas City in January of next year. And I hadn't heard about it until a friend introduced me to this guy. Fascinating. The music is incredible. He's performed some of the songs with an 800-person choir in front of the Jefferson Memorial. There's some really, really cool things going on with this project, and I really think we're trying to help ignite it. And we're going to tell his story over the next 2 nights. We'll have part 1 tonight, part 2 tomorrow. And coming up next week on Bookview, I'm going to be interviewing Trenton Oldfield. He is the guy that jumped into the water and disrupted the Oxford-Cambridge boat race because of the level of income disparity here in the United Kingdom. And the Crown and the courts went after him, tried to deport him. He's got a fascinating story told in a book, and we're going to be interviewing him. So it's been a really, really good week for us.
All right, youtube.com/worldview show. We'll talk to Dennis next week and be back with plenty more after this.